What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected voices sits down for what should be a simple morning chat, only to face an interrogation that crosses every line? In just 41 seconds, a beloved actor walks off set, leaving behind a stunned studio and a host whose arrogance just cost him the interview of a lifetime. Morgan Freeman arrived at the Good Morning America studio that morning, expecting a conversation about his latest film project. What he got instead was something nobody saw coming. The cameras were rolling, the audience was settled in, and the panel was ready. George Stephanopoulos sat center stage, flanked by Robin Roberts and Michael Strawn. The energy seemed normal at first, casual, friendly even. The makeup team had just finished their final touches. Morgan looked relaxed in his chair, reviewing some notes about the film. The studio buzzed with that familiar pre-show energy. Crew members checked camera angles. The audience, mostly tourists and longtime fans, chatted excitedly about getting to see a living legend in person. Everything pointed to another smooth morning show segment. George shuffled his papers, that familiar serious expression settling on his face. He'd been in this business long enough to know how these things worked. Or at least he thought he did. Robin was reviewing her own notes, occasionally glancing up to smile at audience members. Michael was joking with the cameraman, that easy charisma making everyone around him comfortable. The floor director counted down. 5, 4, 3, 2. The red light blinked on. "Welcome back, everyone," George began, his voice carrying that practiced television smoothness. "We have a very special guest with us this morning, an actor whose voice alone can command a room, whose presence on screen is nothing short of iconic. Please welcome the legendary Morgan Freeman." The audience erupted in applause. Some people stood. A few whistled. This was the kind of guest that made their early morning trip to Times Square worth it. Morgan walked onto the set with that familiar, calm presence filling the room. He moved with an easy grace, shaking hands with each panel member. First Robin, who beamed at him. Then Michael, who pulled him into a brief hug. Finally George, who offered a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Morgan settled into the guest chair, adjusting his jacket, that easy smile on his face. The audience was still clapping. He acknowledged them with a small wave. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you all." Robin leaned forward, her warmth genuine and immediate. "Morgan, it is such an honor to have you here. Truly. We've been looking forward to this conversation all week." "The pleasure is mine," Morgan replied, his voice carrying that distinctive tone everyone recognizes instantly. "I always enjoy coming by. You folks run a good ship here." Michael grinned. "Well, we try. Though, I have to say, having you here raises the bar considerably. I mean, come on, it's Morgan Freeman." The audience laughed. Morgan chuckled along with them. Even George smiled, though something in his posture suggested he was already elsewhere, mentally preparing for something. "So," Robin continued, keeping things light and conversational, "before we dive into the new film, how has your morning been? Traffic treating you okay?" Morgan nodded. "Oh, you know New York. It's always an adventure. But I left early enough. Gave myself plenty of time." "Smart man," Michael said. "I've been here for years, and I still can't figure out the traffic patterns." "Nobody can," Morgan replied. "I think that's part of the city's charm. Keeps you on your toes." George shifted in his seat, papers rustling. Robin shot him a quick glance, but continued. "So let's talk about the new film. You've got quite the role here. From what I understand, this is a pretty complex character. What drew you to this project?" Morgan's expression became more thoughtful. This was the question he'd come prepared to answer. "Well, at this stage of my career, I'm very selective about what I take on. I have to be. The script has to speak to me. The character has to offer something new, something I haven't explored before. And this one did. The director, who I've worked with once before, sent me the script with a note that just said, I wrote this with you in mind. That's flattering, of course, but it's also a responsibility. How so? Michael asked, genuinely interested. Because it means someone has envisioned you in a role. They've already seen you bringing this character to life in their mind. So you have to honor that vision while also bringing your own interpretation to it. It's a balance. The character in this film, he's a man dealing with his past, with choices he made decades ago that are now coming back to confront him. He's not entirely sympathetic. He's made mistakes, but he's also human, flawed, real. That's what interested me. Robin nodded enthusiastically. That complexity is what makes it so compelling. I watched an early screening, and your performance is just... it's powerful. Thank you, Morgan said graciously. The whole cast really brought their best. When you're surrounded by talented people, it elevates everyone's work. Speaking of the cast, Michael chimed in, you've got some incredible actors alongside you. What was the dynamic like on set? Morgan smiled, settling deeper into the conversation. It was collaborative. Everyone came ready to work. There was this one scene, probably the most emotionally demanding scene in the film, where we did 17 takes. Not because anyone was getting it wrong, but because we kept finding new layers. The director would say, "That was perfect, but let's try it one more time." And we'd discover something new. That's the kind of environment where real magic happens. George had been quiet through all of this, his fingers tapping against his notepad. Robin and Michael were doing exactly what good hosts do, asking engaging questions, letting the guest speak, building a natural flow. But George wasn't listening. Not really. He was waiting. And about 2 minutes into Morgan's answer about the collaborative process, he cut in. "That's fascinating," George interrupted, though his tone suggested otherwise. The shift was abrupt enough that Michael actually stopped mid-nod. But I want to pivot here for a moment. I think our viewers are more interested in something else, something beyond the film. "That's fascinating," George interrupted, though his tone suggested otherwise. But I want to pivot here. I think our viewers are more interested in something else. Robin shot George a quick glance. Something in his tone had shifted. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees. Morgan paused, patient, but noticeably different now. His smile faded slightly. Not into a frown, but into something more neutral, watchful. "Sure," Morgan said slowly, measuring his words. "What would you like to discuss?" "Well," George continued, leaning back in his chair with an air of casual confidence that bordered on arrogance. His whole demeanor had changed. Where before he'd seemed like just another panel member, now he looked like a prosecutor preparing to deliver a closing argument. "There's been some talk, some controversy around certain comments you've made in past interviews. Comments about race, about politics, about social issues. Comments where you've suggested that people should just, quote, get over it. That if we stop talking about certain things, they'll simply go away." The studio went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet where people are leaning in with interest. The uncomfortable kind. The kind where everyone can feel something going wrong, but nobody knows quite how to stop it. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his easy smile vanishing. Robin's expression tightened, her eyes flashing with concern. A few audience members exchanged confused glances. Morgan's face remained calm, but something flickered in his eyes. A wariness, an understanding that this wasn't going to be the conversation he'd signed up for. "I'm not sure what you're referring to specifically," he said carefully, his voice measured. "Perhaps you could be more specific about which comments concern you." George waved his hand dismissively, as if Morgan's request for clarity was just an attempt to dodge the question. "Oh, come on. You know exactly what I'm talking about. You've been quoted multiple times saying that talking about racism makes it worse. That we should just stop discussing it and it'll go away. That we should stop dividing ourselves by race and just be Americans. Don't you think that's a pretty privileged position to take? Don't you think that dismisses the very real experiences of millions of people? George, Robin interjected, gently, trying to steer things back toward civility. Maybe we should... No, no. George cut her off without even looking at her. His focus was entirely on Morgan, like a predator locked onto prey. I think this is important. We have Morgan Freeman here, someone with a significant platform, someone whose words carry weight. And I think our audience deserves to hear him explain these positions. Don't you think people have a right to be upset by what you've said? Don't you think they have a right to question whether you're out of touch? Morgan took a breath. When he spoke, his voice was measured, but firm. Not defensive, but clear. What I've said, consistently throughout my career, is that we should judge people by their character and actions, not by labels we assign to each other. That's not controversial. That's basic human decency. I've never said racism doesn't exist. I've never said people's experiences aren't real. What I've said is that obsessing over differences, constantly reinforcing divisions, doesn't help us move forward together. But that's easy for you to say, isn't it? George's voice had taken on an edge now, sharp and accusing. You've made it. You're successful. You're wealthy. You've transcended, as some people might say. So of course you can afford to take that position. But what about the people who haven't made it? What about the people still struggling? Don't they deserve to have their struggles acknowledged? I never said they didn't, Morgan replied, his patience clearly being tested, but still holding. You're putting words in my mouth. Am I? George leaned forward now, his voice rising slightly, in that way television hosts do when they think they've made a point. Because you've also said, and I'm quoting here, he pulled out a tablet and began reading from it, that Black history is American history and shouldn't be relegated to 1 month. And yet you've profited enormously from the very system you claim to want to move past. You've played the wise mentor, the magical helper, the saintly figure. You've benefited from the very stereotypes and categories you now say we should ignore. Isn't that hypocritical? Isn't that having it both ways? The audience gasped. A few people actually whispered, "Oh no," loud enough to be heard. Michael's jaw clenched. His hands gripped the arms of his chair. Michael tried to step in, his voice tight with controlled anger. Hey man, I don't think that's really fair. You're taking things out of context and... It's a legitimate question, George snapped, spinning toward Michael with barely contained irritation that someone would dare interrupt his line of questioning. His voice rose even louder now. Morgan has built a career, a very successful career, playing certain types of roles, often as the wise mentor figure, the magical helper, the dignified elder. And there's nothing wrong with that necessarily. But when you then turn around and act like race doesn't matter, like we should just forget about these categories, it rings hollow. It seems convenient. Stop, Morgan said quietly, but with such weight that George actually paused mid-breath. The single word cut through the tension like a knife. Just stop right there. Excuse me? George's eyebrows shot up, his expression one of theatrical surprise mixed with indignation. I'm sorry. Are you saying I can't ask you questions? Isn't that why you're here? Didn't you agree to come on this show knowing we might ask difficult questions? I'm here, Morgan replied, his voice still controlled, but carrying an unmistakable edge now, each word deliberate and weighted, to talk about a film, a piece of art that a lot of talented people worked very hard on, people who poured their hearts and souls into this project. I'm not here to be lectured by someone who clearly came into this with an agenda, someone who clearly wasn't interested in a conversation, but in a confrontation. An agenda? George laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. It was harsh, mocking, the kind of laugh designed to make someone else look foolish. I'm a journalist. My agenda is the truth, and the truth is that you've made millions. Tens of millions. Playing into stereotypes while simultaneously claiming you're above discussing the very issues that created those stereotypes. You want to be celebrated as this wise, transcendent figure, but you don't want to acknowledge the framework that made that image possible. Robin spoke up more forcefully now, her voice sharp with barely contained fury. George, this really isn't appropriate. This is not how we conduct interviews. Morgan is our guest. He deserves respect. Our guest who thinks he's too important to answer tough questions, George shot back, not even trying to hide his contempt anymore. Tell me, Morgan, do you think your success gives you the right to tell other Black Americans how they should feel about racism? Do you think your money, your fame, your comfortable life insulates you from criticism? Because I think our viewers might disagree. I think they might find it pretty offensive that someone who's benefited so much from the system wants to tell everyone else to just be quiet about it. The audience had gone completely silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle, nothing. You could feel the tension radiating through the studio like electricity. The air itself felt charged. Michael looked like he wanted to physically remove George from his chair. His face was a mask of barely restrained anger. Robin had her hand on her forehead, clearly mortified, her professionalism warring with her desire to shut this whole thing down immediately. Morgan stood up slowly. He didn't rush. He didn't storm off. He simply unclipped his microphone with careful deliberation, his movements precise and controlled. Every eye in the studio followed his hands as he removed the small device and placed it carefully on the arm of his chair. "What are you doing?" George asked, and for the first time, there was a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice, a crack in the armor. "Where do you think you're going?" "I'm choosing not to participate in whatever this is," Morgan said simply, his voice calm but final. He set the microphone down with the gentleness of someone who refuses to let anger dictate his actions. "I came here in good faith. I came here to have a conversation, to talk about work that I'm proud of, work that means something. But this isn't a conversation. This isn't even an interview. This is an ambush. And I don't do ambushes. I don't participate in theater designed to tear people down for ratings." "Oh, so you're just going to run away?" George's voice took on a mocking tone, that false confidence rushing back in. "That's convenient, isn't it? That's really convenient. Ask a few hard questions, and suddenly the legendary Morgan Freeman can't handle it. Maybe if you spent less time lecturing people about how they should deal with discrimination, and more time actually listening to people who are still struggling with it, you'd understand why these questions matter. But no, you'd rather just walk away. You'd rather just... "George, enough!" Robin practically shouted, her composure finally breaking. She stood up from her chair, her voice cutting through George's tirade. "That is enough. This is completely unacceptable." But George wasn't done. He seemed to be spiraling now, like he'd committed to this path and couldn't figure out how to get off it. He turned to the camera, ignoring both Robin and Michael, speaking directly to the viewers at home. And there you have it, folks. When confronted with his own contradictions, when asked to actually defend positions he's taken publicly, Morgan Freeman walks off. I guess some questions are just too difficult for some people to answer. I guess when you're rich and famous enough, you don't have to engage with criticism. You can just... "George, I swear to God!" Michael's voice boomed across the studio. He was standing now too, his massive frame imposing, his usual friendly demeanor completely gone. "You need to stop talking right now. You need to check yourself, man, because this is way out of line." Morgan had already turned toward the exit, his dignity fully intact, despite the chaos erupting behind him. He moved with purpose, but without haste, refusing to give George the satisfaction of seeing him flee. His posture was straight, his expression neutral. If he was angry, he wasn't showing it. If he was hurt, he was keeping it inside. He was simply leaving, and doing so with more grace than the situation deserved. George turned on Michael, his voice rising to match the former football player's volume. "Oh, so now you're going to defend him. That's interesting. That's really interesting, Michael. Maybe you agree with him. Maybe you also think racism isn't worth discussing anymore. Maybe you also think people should just get over centuries of oppression and inequality. Is that it? Is that what you think?" "That's not what he said, and you know it," Michael fired back, stepping closer to George's desk. "You twisted everything he said. You took his words out of context. You came at him with disrespect from the jump. This wasn't journalism, George. This was a hit job. This was you trying to make yourself look important by tearing down someone who actually is important." Robin was frantically signaling to someone off camera, her hands moving urgently. "We need to go to commercial. Now. Right now. Cut to commercial." But George kept going, his voice getting even louder, his face flushed. "I'm just asking the questions everyone's thinking. I'm just doing what journalists are supposed to do. Why is it my fault if he can't handle scrutiny? He's a public figure. He's put his opinions out there for public consumption. I have every right, every obligation even, to challenge them. That's what we do here. That's what real journalism looks like." "You have a responsibility to treat guests with basic respect," Robin countered, her voice trembling with anger. "That wasn't journalism, George. That wasn't asking tough questions. That was a hit job. That was you deciding before he even walked through the door that you were going to attack him. And for what? For some viral moment? For some clip that people will share on social media? Well, congratulations. You got your moment. But at what cost?" A producer rushed onto the set, headset askew, looking panicked. "We're still live. We're still broadcasting. Someone needs to—" "I know we're still live," Robin snapped at the producer, though her anger clearly wasn't directed at him. "That's the problem. That's the whole problem." Morgan had reached the edge of the set now. A senior producer, a woman who'd worked with the show for 15 years, tried to intercept him, her expression apologetic. "Mr. Freeman, please, I'm so sorry. This wasn't... We didn't know he was going to... Can we please just talk for a moment?" Morgan paused, looking at her with kind eyes. "It's not your fault," he said gently. "But I'm not staying. I can't stay. This isn't what I agreed to." "I completely understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This should never have happened. You were treated terribly." Morgan nodded once, then continued toward the exit. Behind him, the argument was still raging. George was still talking to the camera, his voice taking on a defensive edge now. "We'll be right back, and when we return, we'll discuss what just happened here. Because I think it's important that we talk about accountability. About how celebrities think they can just dismiss legitimate questions. About how wealth and fame can insulate people from having to engage with the real issues facing." "Cut the feed," someone yelled from offstage. "George, stop talking. Cut!" But the damage was done. The whole exchange had played out live, broadcast into millions of homes across the country. Millions of viewers had just watched a respected actor, a man who'd spent decades building a reputation for dignity and thoughtfulness, get ambushed on morning television. They'd watched a host lose complete control of an interview, turning what should have been a pleasant promotional conversation into a confrontation that served absolutely no one. Michael was pacing now, his hands on his head, shaking it back and forth. When he spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled rage. "Man, what were you thinking? What was that? What was any of that? We've had controversial guests before. We've asked tough questions before. But that wasn't tough questions. That was disrespectful. That was unprofessional. That was beneath us." Robin had her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking slightly. When she looked up, her expression was a mixture of anger, disappointment, and something that looked almost like grief. "Do you have any idea what you just did? Any idea at all? That was Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman, George. One of the most respected actors in the world. and you just drove him off our set. You just humiliated him on live television." George seemed to be coming down from whatever had possessed him. The adrenaline was fading, and reality was starting to seep in. His confidence was cracking, hairline fractures spreading across his certainty. "I was doing my job. I was asking important questions. Someone had to challenge him. Someone had to..." Important questions? Robin's voice was sharp as broken glass. "You attacked him. From the moment he sat down, you were looking for a fight. You weren't interested in his answers. You were interested in making a point. That wasn't an interview, George. That was an execution. And you know what the worst part is? You seemed to enjoy it. You seemed proud of yourself." "I was not..." George started, but his voice trailed off. "Yes, you were," Michael cut in. "You were on some kind of power trip, some kind of ego thing. And you know what? Maybe Morgan could have answered your questions. Maybe he would have engaged if you'd approached it with even a shred of respect. But you didn't want a discussion. You wanted a victim. And when he refused to play that role, when he had the dignity to simply leave, you mocked him for it. You mocked a man for having the self-respect to walk away from disrespect." The studio was chaos now. Absolute chaos. Producers were running around in every direction, some on phones, others huddled in frantic conversations. The technical crew looked shell-shocked, unsure whether they should keep cameras rolling or power everything down. The audience sat in stunned silence, many of them looking uncomfortable, a few actually getting up to leave. This wasn't what they'd signed up for when they arrived at 4:30 in the morning for a chance to see a morning show taping. One audience member, an elderly woman in the third row, actually had tears in her eyes. She'd been a Morgan Freeman fan for 40 years. She'd waited in line for 3 hours to see him in person, and she'd just watched him get treated like that. George stood up from his chair, adjusting his jacket, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "I stand by what I did. Someone needed to challenge him. Someone needed to ask the hard questions that nobody else was willing to ask." "You didn't challenge him," Robin said, her voice cold enough to freeze water. She walked right up to him, not backing down an inch. "You disrespected him. You put words in his mouth. You twisted statements he's made over the years to fit your narrative. You came in with a script, with an agenda, and you executed it regardless of what he actually said. And you did it all with this smug, self-satisfied attitude, like you were doing the world a favor. Like you were some brave truth-teller standing up to power. But you know what? He wasn't being evasive. He wasn't being difficult. He was trying to answer your questions honestly, until you made it clear you didn't actually care about his answers." "I was trying to get real answers," George insisted, but he was clearly defensive now. His hands moved as he talked, gesturing wildly. "I was trying to push past the PR spin, the rehearsed responses, the..." "Real answers?" Michael laughed bitterly, a sound devoid of any humor. "Man, you didn't want answers. You wanted blood. You wanted a confrontation. You wanted a moment that would go viral, that would get people talking. And you know what? You got one. Congratulations. You got exactly what you wanted. Just not the one you were hoping for. Because everyone watching at home didn't see you as some fearless journalist. They saw you as a bully. They saw you attack a guest who came here in good faith." Robin turned away from George, addressing the producers, who were still frantically trying to figure out next steps. Morgan Freeman had left the building with his dignity fully intact. George Stephanopoulos sat alone, realizing too late the difference between good journalism and attack.